Hello, everyone, dear Paradigma listeners. It's a Turkish podcast name, so you're more or less fond of listening for the past 6 years, but we also go with Paradigm in its English translation by the name. So we are really delighted to have two distinguished speakers today, two distinguished scholars in the field of affect and emotion. So we are hosting this series with my colleague İrem Karamak for the past more or less 8 to 9 episodes by now, for sure. And then we are going more or less to talk in depth of political psychology, especially more or less in terms of its philosophical meanings, in terms of its political psychological meanings, or more or less in its implications towards international relations and political science and what have you. So we have two distinguished speakers. Let's introduce them, Jan Slaby and Christian von Scheve. So welcome, dear professors, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you for sparing the time because we wanted to go also with your work. It has also been translated to Turkish, by the way, as a book from İletişim Yayınları, the publications. So we wanted to go talking a bit in depth about your work on affect and emotion, especially its implications in the 21st century. So when we look at your chapter, it presents more or less affect, emotion, and feeling as like fundamental links between the individual, the state, the social, or perhaps the intimate meanings or the political meanings, implications of it, if I may. So could you perhaps introduce this central argumentation in the chapter and explain us in depth how you understand the relationship between affect and emotion, which is a bit complicated for us in international relations scholars?
Yeah, maybe let me start with something that everybody might be able to relate to. Namely, in our book, we talk about Christian Amanpour, the famous CNN anchor, who witnessed this famous episode in the Oval Office where Trump and J.D. Vance basically insulted, dressed down Zelensky in front of the live television cameras. And then CNN, they didn't run a commentary on that. They just ran the face of Amanpour glaring at her screen in disbelief, eyes wide open. And so you could, it's an actual interesting episode. It's complicated. You could say Amanpour had the right affect. She was shocked that the transatlantic order was taken down. But instead of that shock, it wasn't presented as a message, as a commentary, as a reasonable take. It was turned into a meme instantly and basically offered up as clickbait on CNN's website. That's how I encountered it. And that was, in a way, you could say, here you see affect at work today. The private feeling in its public form, the public representative, a famed journalist whose important voice, I guess, turned into clickbait. You could say an apt emotional reaction, but then immediately recycled or put into the news cycle to be scrolled through the feed. And so you could say affect now is a story, and the analysis, the thing you actually pay a journalist for, is dropping out of the equation. And of course, that's fully intended. When you see this reaction, you think, oh, Trump and Vance wanted exactly that. They wanted to dominate the news cycle. They wanted to produce these sort of quick memes. And so it's interesting that we've arrived there. We can later maybe talk about that this is even old now because it's 2025. I guess in 26 we see even other AI generated forms of memes. So you don't even need the actual person in the loop at all. But that's maybe another story. Yeah, and affect and emotion, I think we don't want to sharply distinguish here, but you could say affect, and Christian might continue here. Affect is the initial shock wave, the resonance, the thing. Imagine someone saying something improper at the dinner and everybody has this cringe. Oh my God, what did he say? That's the affect. And then only later it might consolidate into indignation, into some emotion that has a name, that has a narrative, that has, you could say it's the same energy, the same effective energy, but differently framed. With affect, it's not yet in any condensed form. With emotion, it is narrativized, it's labeled, and you can recognize it and talk about it. But usually in every interesting social episode, you have both all the time. And so I don't think we want to make a big mess of this contrast, but rather I think as tools, as conceptual tools, you need both affect and emotion um, in the picture.
I would say, and I mean, I guess Jan wouldn't disagree that affect is probably something that is going on, that is running all the time. Sometimes very subtle, sometimes in the background. It's a certain mode with which you relate to and with the world, and sometimes you have these peaks and outbursts, etc., where they color all of your experience, and when they're and then quite often this happens in typical or prototypical situations, right? So that we can recognize and we can make affect intelligible because they tend to arise in prototypical situations. For example, if you are being insulted, if you are experiencing a loss, if something nice has happened, etc., etc., and then we have this tendency to categorize these things into emotions that carry linguistic labels, emotion words, and that they have all this cultural meaning baggage that we know from literature and film and also from scientific theory, etc., etc. Yeah, maybe that as a brief addition to the affect emotion thing, and yeah, and maybe also one more sentence because Jan described it nicely with his Amanpour vignette, is that that's probably also something that why the two of us are caught by scenes like that is because at least in the tradition of Western liberal publics for the past 30, 40, 50 years, they have done a lot to keep emotions in political discourse and public debate at bay. It was not something that was valued, that was cherished, that was sought, but quite the contrary. There was always this ideal to have something like a rational discourse that is calm. We were going for deliberation, for compromise, etc., etc. Of course, this has always been an ideal, but the example that Jan gave is an indication of that. Not just are people maybe becoming aware that this is an ideal, but it's going far beyond that. That affect and emotion at times certainly tend to replace that what has been a fully fledged journalistic commentary or a calm assessment of things, etc., etc. Then affect really moves center stage, and that was also something. We thought this is worthy of further inquiry.
Thank you for the answers. I love how you came up with this because I work on visuals and emotions, how visuals and emotions are related. In a way, perhaps that image, that moment was kind of a shortcut for that effect moment for you. So I feel much more connected to the book now that I know this. So on to the next question. In a way, to interrogate why we need emotions in social theory now. Like what makes affect and emotion foundational to social theory for the 21st century? And you also talk about what it adds to the theory. Additionally, you talk about issues of relationality. So merging all these concepts and whys together, I want to ask you what it brings to the table, what it adds to social theory.
Yes, okay. I mean, maybe I start with something pre-theoretically, hopefully obvious, that other theoretical alternatives, think of reason-based accounts or rational choice theory, have a hard time understanding motivation. And well, when do people storm a capital, or when do protesters stand in front of a tank, risk for physical harm? Or, when some bankers come in a country and measure and present austerity measures, like think of Greece 15, 18 years ago, this lands as humiliation in the people, not as a, they don't look at the spreadsheet and say, oh, that's reasonable. They feel humiliated and they will vote accordingly. So I think it's just on the surface of it, what moves people and what moves, people to risky action, to political action, to very dangerous or operations is it must be something more than some sort of cold calculative reason that looks at consequences only and calculates results or takes some sort of academic long view on the issue. No, it's something much more tangible, and that's, I think, well captured as relational affect, or this relational dynamics. And of course it's then played out in countless varieties. Well, think of something, I mean, let's stay on the example level. Think of something as foundational for our societies as money. What is money if not a thing that is absolutely trusted, that people have faith in, that is kind of an effective institution, and we let something very abstract basically dominate our lives. And it's certainly a more complicated story, but it has a total affective working on messaging in there. So it's trust on the one hand, but money is of course also this sort of object of desire and object of, well, something that is foundational to the social fabric, but I don't think you can understand it without the effective dimension. And you can run through various examples of institutions where, you might not think of affect and emotion when you think of institutions, but then suddenly you see, oh, how are people actually attached to these things? Why are people actually believing in, the school, the law courts, the national symbols, and so on, when there's not this effective dimension in there? I mean, I think that's a surface level answer here.
There's not much to add from my side. I mean, it might be worth pointing out this social theory for the 21st century thing. And I mean, for sure, we are in no way the first ones to put affect and emotion front stage. I mean, they've been all around in philosophy as well as in sociology. But this combination for the 21st century is the things that you do theory on and the things that you attend to as researchers. I mean, they do not appear in a vacuum, right? And the 21st century to us has marked, I don't know, something that we just discussed in the previous section, that this widespread impression that I share, that probably most of us share, is that things have become more emotional. And we can talk about the reasons, or whether this is just we talk about it more, or it's actually there more, or many other different things. But that is the motivational thing. That is, in the German sociological world, you would say that is the Gesellschaftstheorie aspect, sort of a certain societal constellation in a certain point in historical time prompts you to look at certain things specifically that you probably wouldn't do if you would have done this 100 or 200 years ago, or maybe 400 years in the future. But now it's urgent. Yeah, it's there. And so I think this is the comment, that emotions and affect are there, and that they're all over the place is not really, I think it's not really a new claim. It's just taking claims that have been made previously seriously and then rearranging them for a particular social and political constellation that we are seeing today.
Definitely. We also tend to argue similar fashion, professors, like when we talk about international relations and more or less social mobility or social mobilization, political protests. And sometimes we tend to have like hard time with my colleagues. Sometimes she would also maybe agree in like conferences, or like when we send a publication arguing that emotions and affect do matter in international relations, we tend to get some eyebrows raised. So that tends to be like the general, more or less. So it gives us joy and pleasure to talk about the philosophical and like day-to-day aspects with you, working on this field for many years. So coming to maybe it also matters in international relations to us, like particularly when we study modalities of power or relationality or when you say like affective relationality. How does taking such a perspective perhaps like help us understand the operation or the modus vivendi of power? When we talk about institutions, we enter with Professor Jan with like media or like everyday social practices. How does it resonate there?
Well, first off, I mean that's something I think here our Berlin-based research cluster thinks very strongly about, that affect actually is a modality of power, and you can kind of capture insights all the way back to Spinoza in philosophy and of certainly Foucault on the microdynamics of power with the concept of affect. And I think even this sort of very basic thought that Spinoza somewhat articulated, that affect affective relations are those relations that either strengthen or diminish your own powers, your own capacity. So I think everybody can relate to this. Some people are such that they enhance us. They enter the room and we kind of feel strengthened. We feel ourselves more powerful, more funny, more motivated. And others, it's a nightmare when you have a boss that sucks your energy, that slows everything down, or that you in some sort of way, or drains you by asking shitty questions all the time. Or somehow there are these people who suck the energy literally out of the room. And I mean, if they're your bosses, it can be horrible, and you have to kind of play up to them. And that's a very phenomenological observation that everybody knows, but it tends to be forgotten. And now, if you scale this up, if that's actually how interpersonal relations work, that people variously enhance and diminish themselves. And if you scale this up to a huge a heat map of power relations to society, it gets interesting. And you can then understand, okay, and that was, I think, also Spinoza's early insight, that these relations cluster into bundles and can be organized, composed, recomposed. And that's a very basic initial idea of institutions. Institutions are these sort of centers of specifically apportioned energy, and zones of relative high social energy or low social energy, and affect is what makes them run. And it sounds very abstract, but if you go into concrete institutions, of course, I mean, a court of law has this sort of intimidating function, or sometimes a school can be very intimidating, particularly to children from less educated families, or not to think, prisons, refugee camps, hospitals. So it gets power kind of condenses in these sites, and affect is a great analytic to look at these. So it scales from the very personal to these sort of more collective dynamics. And I think, similar to what Christian said before, it's not new, because Spinoza did it for several hundred years, but it tends to get forgotten when you have these other theories on the macro level of on rationality or discourse or whatever. You forget about these sort of very basic features of affective relations in the everyday. So I think that's why I think that this PowerPoint that affect is power is, I think, a very central and focal insight. And that makes also, I think it makes clear what we mean by affective relationality. It's not just some sort of relation, but it's a relation that enhances your capacities or diminishes them, that energizes you or drains you of energy. And I think that scales to various societal levels.
Yeah, and it provides, at least in sociology, I mean, by now there are certainly many broader understandings. But when I studied sociology, the definition of power that I learned was Max Weber's definition, which is something like power is the capacity of somebody to coerce his or her will on someone else, even against their resistance, right? And that is a very particular, and in my view, very, very narrow conception of power. I'm not saying, but since then, a lot has happened, and there are many other theories. But this is a much broader, much more comprehensive view that Jan outlined, which helps us see power dynamics as they're going on in various fields of society. And let me also add that maybe this is also a thing that is slightly specific to the view that we've been developed over the past decade or so in the Berlin Center, is that in some fields of affect theory, you have a view of affect that is very much geared towards its emancipatory power, its disruptive power, its liberating powers. You know, there's this idea you can overcome all the barriers and obstacles by taking affect seriously. But what we would be saying, no, yes, that may be true, but affect also runs the other way. Affect can also work to harden boundaries, to to reinforce structural inequalities, etc., to make, I don't know, to make institutions that might corroborate inequalities, to harden these institutions and make them resilient against reform or anything like that. So there's always this dual nature or dual perspective, I think, that we need to take when we talk about affect and power. And it also has a view, or it also includes a view of affect in which people are sort of receptive to these pattern powers in terms of incorporating certain modes of being, I don't know, institutionally disadvantaged, etc., etc. So affect as a bodily thing, you know, these dynamics, these inequalities, these power relations, they're being inscribed in your bodies, and that's why it might also be particularly difficult to overcome them. But it's socially patterned. That is something where other people might say, "Oh, no. The idea of affect is not patterned, it's pre-reflexive, pre-linguistic, blah blah blah." But that is something that we would focus on and emphasize.
Great answers. Thank you so much. I love that you're approaching this not top to down. It's not something that evil governments are managing all the time, but also we are talking about body and in society relations and stuff. I love that dimension of effect that are often missed. Well, I will kind of drag the topic on things that I'm also working on, visuals, media, and platforms, and perhaps AI even. So the question is, so you are talking about these society relations and effect, and my question is mostly that we have the networked media, we have these platforms, social media platforms that have their own algorithms. We have now AI. So we have this, I don't know, bubbles that we are only saying what we like and repost. So what does an effective perspective reveal in these situations? What does effect do in connection with the network media and these kind of platforms, or even maybe AI, in order to, bring these in conversation?
Yeah, that's a big question that calls for, I guess, a separate treatment at all, maybe a whole new book. And I think things change very rapidly. Of course, on a general level, we can say these networked media, of course, run on affect, as we saw with the Amanpour example. And the evolution is so fast. Today, there's so much AI generated content that also is in the business of exemplifying affect. Like, even you could say it's pathos formula, sad images, grandiose images, joyful images, whatever, outrage producing images, but not with actual humans anymore. So in a way, the Amanpour thing is ancient. Like, now, 1.5 years on, you have what people call slopaganda, AI produced gibberish, like the crying baby or the grandma in front of a cake saying nobody said happy birthday to me. Or, there was this, I don't know if that's true, I've just heard this, there was this hurricane, and then there was apparently many people died, and then there's this AI produced image that actually stirred a lot of people to empathy and grief. So you could say the real atrocities are not even registering anymore. They don't don't stir any affects, but it's just an AI stand-in. So it's kind of a surrogate. I like to talk about surrogate emotions, emotions that lack actual friction with reality, actual touch with reality. And I think that's only one. I'm absolutely not the theory of network media here, but it's one dimension in which network media can create an effective loop and effective content universe that's completely detached from reality. And even on the production side, you don't even need to photograph a real face or have a real person. And even people understand it when they see Trump in Mount Rushmore. They understand it's crap, but it's still out there and it floods the zone and it somehow stirs it. I don't know what it does to us, but it's definitely exploiting the malleability and transferability of affect and the way that affect can be molded in all sorts of forms and fashions. I think it also tires people at some point. Sometimes you just have enough and you want to see a real human face, or you want to go out in the countryside or whatever. But so far, I guess in the media, you have a lot of this sort of virtuality, thinned out surrogates going on, and it's an onslaught. And we're absolutely not at the end. You can write a new chapter with new examples like every 6 weeks, I guess. So I don't want to claim anything here. Just observe what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I also have to say I'm really not a network and media communication scholar, but I mean, what I find so at the same time interesting and also so concerning is that algorithms they literally feed on users' emotions, and not just any emotions, but particular emotions. And by now, there's a couple of studies that show that they are feeding and monitorizing on particularly those emotions that are suspected to cause rifts and resentments and antagonisms in society, which are then, I mean, I'm not saying all of them are. Certainly, there are legitimate grievances, actual grievances, inequalities, injustices, etc., etc. But there's also so much of what Young call these surrogate emotions, and I would assume that many of them are driven by algorithms feeding on and capitalizing on these particular emotions.
This reminded me of Susan Muller's compassion fatigue, that even like in the age of AI, we are having this compassion fatigue for things that doesn't exist. Like we are having compassion towards those crafted images as well. But like back then, compassion was sold by this network media, and now it is in the hands of anyone and everyone, and for non existing reasons as well. So it's really interesting and concerning.
I have a concept here that I use all the time. That's unfeeling. And that's, I mean, often we make a mistake, I guess, when we talk about affect and emotion. We always think, first of all, we need the intensive, the evident emotion where really the temperature is up and everybody is kind of affected. But if you think of affect as power, it's also the power to tune it down and to flood the zone with such contents that the actual real emotions that would stick, that would stay with someone, that would make them maybe reconsider their actions or whatever, that is crowded out or doesn't even materialize. So what results is it's not a lack of feeling so much as this sort of thinned out, toned down, moderated, sloppy, inauthentic and superficial feeling. And that's, I think, the great area of all this content slop that circulates through our phones. And compassion fatigue is a good example. It also because so many events and real happenings from all over the world are just juxtaposed in a forever loop. and you can't really attend to anything. So you can say it's like it's an overflow with the reality. On the other hand, it's also a zone flooded with unreality, with fake, with things that you don't really know if it's fake or not. And so all these sort of many shades of unfeeling can result, even in people who are actually well-meaning and want to engage and are actually seeking out maybe some new contents, but the onslaught is just coming. So I think it's not just, it's a perspective on unfeeling, how it is produced and maintained, and who's actually behind it, and what varieties are there. But I think that's an interesting media theoretic angle, and going away from these hot emotions and hot affects in media to these sort of zones of numbness, apathy, and superficiality.
Yeah, I mean, just following on this perspective and example, I don't know and how much you follow the German media landscape, but some find this example naive, but I find it so interesting and relevant, and that is the example of this dying whale in the Baltic Sea. I don't know if you followed that example. There was a whale, I think it was in June or something, or May, and it was sick. It was dying, and it got stranded somewhere in the Baltic Sea, just very much near the coast. And the entire country literally went crazy in their compassion about this whale. And there was an initiative by people with a lot of money who wanted to save the whale, and then they transported him to the open sea. But the scientists, they say, well, it's clear this animal is sick. It will probably die anyways. But there was so much compassion for this, for a sick whale, where we had to say, all right, it's nature. These things tend to happen, whereas we see lacks of compassion in so many other fields and conflicts. And I'm pretty sure that social media, network media play an essential part in that this thing became so huge and affect laden.
Yeah. Speaking of which, thank you very much for those answers. Really, we were thinking about also these, it's empirical or perhaps like methodological implications of what we have been speaking more or less also in your book. Because speaking of, for instance, the themes of, we have been talking about from the beginning of the podcast, like the democratic side of effective politics, or emancipatory, quote unquote, maybe effective politics. How can we translate, as like researchers or like early career researchers just finished their PhDs, like my colleague and I, how can we translate maybe effective relationality into a more context sensitive empirical work, by maybe distinguishing democratic and emancipatory effective politics from the forms that intensify manipulation or constantly push for polarization, or feed on authoritarianism, perhaps? How can we create such a zone of working space, perhaps?
Difficult one. I mean, I think the question about emancipatory affect, or an affect that is inherently emancipatory in terms of spurring an emancipatory politics, I'm not so sure if we are not better off initially at a more neutral level, like Spinoza, when he talks about affects that actually enhance capacity. So you can have movements, and it's super interesting. When does a movement actually take off? When does a movement get galvanized and growing and have really carrying an energy that we have to reckon with this movement? But I think that's somewhat independent of the question whether it's a regressive movement that wants, tends towards right-wing politics, authoritarian closure, is against migrants, whatever, or whether it's an actually emancipatory movement that's in favor of justice, battling inequality or domination. But I'm not sure there are some answers and some attempts here, and say, okay, when you build it on hatred and outrage, it's likely regressive. When you build it on joy, But I'm not sure. What about indignation? What about all these sort of feelings for justice and or this rage at injustice? And it often cuts either way. So I think one analytic move would be to say there's a different analytical level, less normative. When does a collective actually work as an effective arrangement, as a political machine? What are the techniques that actually stir people into action? But then often this doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens either in a, authoritarian country where the energies of the opposition then by definition are against the authoritarians. So they're likely emancipatory in that sense. So the context gives them actually a certain direction. And in other contexts, maybe you have let's say you have a progressive government, but then maybe some forces on the right galvanized, and you have often this, you see it in Germany, you have elites, business elites coalition with, working class people to both lobby for a right-wing polity. And you have people, you give the working class people, they are probably against immigration, whereas the business people want a liberal market landscape, and it doesn't really fit together. But it's kind of joined in order to unleash energies that are against the incumbent politicians, against what is perceived as the establishment. So I guess the boring academic answer is you look at the context, and it's maybe possible to separate the sheer dimension of effective energy and effective mobilization dimension, and Chris can say more on this, from the question whether it's emancipatory or not.
Yeah, I can't I can't say much more on this, but I mean, for one, you could also you could, I think that's pretty much what Jan has done. You can answer that question if you think about, we would probably never ask this question for thought or thinking. Right? We say, oh, should we take thinking out of the picture because it can be harmful and we have conspiracy theories, and nobody would have the idea that, okay, let's take thought and cognition out of politics, right? And so emotions and affect, they make who we are. So we can't just take them out of the picture. And in the ways in which societies have to think about and come up with principles and institutions and practices how to deal with our thinking, from kindergarten to schools to universities to rules for public deliberation and argumentation, etc., etc. I would argue we have to come up with something similar for people's emotions. Also, in a way, make spaces and arenas for people also to legitimately express their emotions, because that is an impression that I have. We have rare occasion. We do have that in the world of sports, for example, right, where there's a legitimate place to run high on emotions, or maybe cultural events, etc., etc. But we also run high on emotions in political domains. But there's hardly space to do that in a legitimate way. And I think that is what is urgently needed. But it probably needs similar things as we have for our thinking. It needs to be educated in a certain way.
Great, thank you so much. I love that thing that thought and cognition wouldn't be questioned. Never thought of that either. Great remarks. So finally, we basically want to ask you your final remarks, or like out of this book or your chapter specifically, which questions or which concepts do you consider specifically important for affect and emotion researchers, or your remarks on effective societies framework? How do that travel beyond Western or European contexts Turkey, for instance, or maybe we will be the ones exploring that. So the question is, what would you give as a final remarks to affect and emotion researchers, especially next generation ones, perhaps like us?
Yeah, well, I think the strength of this framework is less at the level of the concepts per se, but at the where you locate them, where you seed them, where you let them grow. And that's why, I mean, effective relationality is maybe the most abstract, in this sense, least useful. It just orients you. But when you look at, I mean, we developed this concept of effective arrangements a few years back, and that's a concept that's absolutely composed in such a way that it should help researchers, empirical researchers, ethnographers, sociologists to go to a specific site and notice the specificity of relations. Where is the energy? What elements are come together? Not just agents, but also the material culture or rituals, practices, discursive elements, what narratives are there. And you can use this as a kind of a blueprint for how to approach a research site to notice affect, also where it's non-obvious. And I would add also notice where affect is blocked and toned down or prevented and so on. So I guess, and the researchers have to fill this concept with life, with their own life and with their domain. You know, that's super important. And many people in our Berlin Center have done this. And this is not something that makes it into our theoretical chapters, this sort of this level of specificity. And I think this also answers in part this question. I mean, of course, our concepts are pretty Western in origin, stemming from Western philosophy. And also, I guess, affect theory, this thing that came from the US, it was basically geared to contemporary late capitalism. And it's about, the joys, but also the depression, the frustrations, the cruelty of capitalist affluent societies and what they do to their citizens. So that's where I guess affect theory was mostly developed. And I don't know, I'm not sure if that travels everywhere so well. But if you use, I mean, in our approach, I think we are much more pragmatic and open in terms of offering these sort of middle range concepts that you can put into your specific domain, wherever that may be, Western or non-Western, and then do something with it. So it's really, I guess it's an empowering message. And we hope that these 2 volumes we did on key concepts, the one that's now in Turkish also, that young scholars find something there. I mean, if there are 20, 25 concepts in a book, not every concept will be equally interesting for your research, but I guess there will be something in there. And we have different shades, from super theoretical, abstract to very concrete and, seated in specific research. So, let me do some advertising here at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I can just follow up. I mean, I would also say the answer to your question really depends also on people's disciplinary background. I mean, we've been a very, very interdisciplinary center, but then again, especially when it comes to early career scholars, I mean, they have to make their PhD in a particular discipline, and certain disciplinary logics kick in. And I think so. The concepts that we are presenting, they always need to be adapted also in these particular disciplinary contexts, with which I do not mean this can be, I don't know, a concept that was introduced by someone from social anthropology can be put to use by someone in, I don't know, literary studies or sociology or so. I think that is the good thing regarding this book. And I would also like to stress what Jan has said. I mean, we were extremely happy when we learned that there will be a Turkish translation of the volume, because it is one thing to do this work in the center. And of course, we also have a couple of colleagues, not too many, who are from different cultural contexts, but it's a completely different thing if you are doing this work in Germany, in the center, in Berlin. That's a very particular environment, and it's really, if these things travel to other cultural contexts, I can imagine that there's so much more to gain if you manage to put them to work in as many different contexts as possible. And that's why I was really so happy to see the Turkish translation, because I probably can't even imagine what you could do with all this stuff in that particular context. And there are so many potential contexts in which you can put that to work. So maybe an invitation to put these tools to work in different contexts.
Definitely. That would be the Turkish copy from İletişim Yayınları in Turkish. It's called. It's one of the, I think, most, if my colleague Irem would correct me on that, like publishes mostly academic work that is either from PhD publications, like PhD dissertations, or highly publicized, like academic articles then turn out to be like books or manuscripts, and sometimes translations of such works that are like your work is very beneficial and very highly publicized, also affects many scholars around many interdisciplinary networks, such as ourselves, from international relations, political science, to philosophy, to sociology. And I think it's very valuable. Both your chapter and also your recent work, most of your works are on the field, are very highly effective. And it's our pleasure to host you this evening to at least get a glimpse of how your thought processes on publishing this work come to being. And it was really beneficial for us as young scholars to get some highly motivational inspiration on our post-doctoral work, on our articles and so sorts. So if my colleague Irem doesn't have further additional remarks, or you professors have further additional remarks, we would like to thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
That was fun.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for coming to our podcast. It really means a lot to us, and also a series on fundamentals of political psychology. And we also thank our listeners